Let's talk to David Spencer. He's head of crime and justice at Policy Exchange, a think tank. He's also a former Metropolitan Police officer. David, what do you make of what we now know, what has emerged in the last 24 hours in relation to what we learned yesterday?
Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
Certainly, as this trial has progressed, and certainly as we've heard more of the evidence, is that this is a case that should never have been prosecuted in the first place. The standard that the Crown Prosecution Service are supposed to compare the evidence against to decide whether a prosecution goes ahead is whether there's a realistic prospect of a conviction. And certainly from the material that's been released in the last 24 hours, it's becoming more and more clear that there was never a realistic prospect of a conviction in this case. And I think that the person whose comments that you just read out has hit the nail on the head, actually. It seems to me that the Independent Office for Police Conduct didn't want to make a decision to take no further action, so they kicked the can down the road to the Crown Prosecution Service. They didn't want to make a decision, so they kicked the can down the road to a jury. And I think we can all be relieved for the wisdom of British juries today.
And it speaks volumes, doesn't it, that a jury, I've covered a number of cases during my career as a journalist, and 3 hours is nothing in a Crown Court case. Sometimes it's days, sometimes it can be over a week, although that, I suppose, is rare. But 3 hours, not knowing everything we know today, simply looking at the facts of the case. Was this murder? Was this not? It took them 3 hours to acquit Sergeant Martin Blake there, and that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Well, you're right. 3 hours is no time at all. It's just about enough time for the jury to get themselves a round of teas and the biscuits out.
And go through everything they've heard as well.
I mean, it really is. It's very, very unusual for juries to come back, particularly with a case with this much evidence. And we only saw a sliver of it in the media yesterday, but a case which had this much evidence. I think the reality as well is that actually it's very, very rare for police officers in this country to discharge a firearm. So in the year to March, there was over 17,000 police operations, armed operations in England and Wales. And police officers discharged their firearms on 2 occasions. That's less than, or it's just about 0.01% of armed operations lead to police officers firing their gun. It's very, very unusual. And unfortunately, what we've seen in this case from the body-worn footage and the other sort of material that's been issued in the last 24 hours is that the officers involved really did have no choice at all in this case.
I mean, this is very weird because Sergeant Martin Blake, whose life I would imagine has been a living hell for the last 2 years, wondering whether he's going to be convicted of murder for doing his job, he's now been acquitted. A jury has gone through this and said it's not murder, but he could face gross misconduct proceedings that could result in his dismissal. What do you make of that? Is that just what happens? But it just seems mad to me that these people, as Bernard Hogan Howe, former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, now in the House of Lords, said in that little clip we heard a little bit earlier, these people are trained to make split-second decisions, but that training is extensive. They're not simply saying, should I shoot this person, should I not? It's based on a lot of training. It's based on an awful lot of consideration that goes into that split second. And actually, if you look at some of the detail that has now emerged in regard to the 67, which is the gang that Chris Kaba was part of, it's reported that the gang had put a £10,000 bounty on Sergeant Blake's head. Such were the fears for his safety and that of his family that he was forced to move out of his home and had to be housed elsewhere with round-the-clock security. An assessment sent to the court by one senior officer read, "In nearly 30 years of service, I have never been more concerned about the welfare of an officer or the risk to them and their family to come to harm as I am about the officer in this case. There is specific intelligence which indicates the risk to the officer's life and that members of the 67 gang actively seek or locate him as a result of the death of Mr. Kaba." This guy and his family, the sergeant, have been through absolute hell. He's been acquitted of murder. Surely you say, Sergeant Blake, you're welcome back on duty to do the job we have trained you to do.
Yeah, it's a remarkable set of circumstances, and I don't mean that in a positive way. The fact that the officer was named in the first place is deeply concerning to me, and certainly in terms of misconduct proceedings, there are some technical differences, in particular the questions that get asked at a misconduct hearing versus a criminal court. So in a criminal court, the main question that gets asked in these sorts of questions is, did the officer in question have an honestly held belief that there was an imminent threat to them or a colleague or the public? And if they did have an honestly held belief, then the jury would find the person not guilty, and that's what's happened in this case. But in a misconduct hearing, the question is slightly different. The question that's asked is, was that belief reasonable or not? And that's the question a misconduct hearing would be asking. So there are some technical difficulties, but it's hard to look at a case like this and not to say, come on, you've had your chance. Two bites of the cherry really seems particularly unfair here. This has now been going on for a couple of years, but the length that these cases go on for, 2 years is not unusual. We were looking at this at Policy Exchange just last year. And, we were looking at cases which had been going on for 10 years, for 8 years, and another case that had been going on for 6 years. So these cases just go on, and it cannot be right that the policy framework and the legislation is set down by government that allows these cases to drag on interminably.
David, thank you. That's David Spencer there, is Head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange, a think tank in London. He's also a former Metropolitan Police officer.